The mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly in every direction, their jagged peaks cutting into the gray morning sky like broken teeth. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane adjusted his rifle scope and scanned the valley below through the pre-dawn darkness. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as he lay motionless behind a cluster of rocks, watching for any sign of movement. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. Still nothing on the thermal, whispered Petty Officer Jake Morrison into his radio. He was positioned 30 meters to Kane's left, his sniper rifle trained on the suspected Taliban compound in the distance. The building sat like a dark stain against the mountainside, its mud brick walls barely visible in the dim light. Kane keyed his radio twice to acknowledge, keeping noise to a minimum. Their SEAL team had been inserted into this remote valley 3 days ago with a simple mission: locate and eliminate a high-value target who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Intelligence suggested the target was hiding in the compound below, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Behind them, the rest of the six-man team waited in defensive positions among the rocks. Petty Officer Luis Rodriguez checked his equipment for the 10th time, running his fingers along his ammunition pouches and grenades. Next to him, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Park monitored the radio frequencies, listening for any chatter that might indicate they had been detected. The youngest member of the team, Petty Officer Tommy Chen, fought to control his breathing as he watched the surrounding ridgelines through his night vision goggles. This was only his second deployment, and the weight of the mission pressed down on him like a physical force. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare someone for the reality of being deep in enemy territory with no backup for miles. Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, the team leader, studied his map one final time before folding it away. At 42, he was the oldest member of the squad and had led more missions than he could count. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes constantly moved, taking in every detail of their surroundings. He knew that in this environment, the smallest mistake could get his entire team killed. The plan was straightforward. At first light, Morrison would provide overwatch while Kane and Rodriguez moved down the mountainside to approach the compound from the east. Park and Chen would establish a blocking position to prevent escape, while Sullivan coordinated the assault from their current position. If everything went according to plan, they would be extracted by helicopter before noon. But plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. As the sun began to rise behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Kane noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks led away from the compound, disappearing into a narrow canyon to the south. The tracks were recent, probably made during the night while the team slept in shifts. "Chief, we've got a problem," Kane whispered into his radio. "Target might have moved during the night, see those tracks heading south." Sullivan raised his binoculars and studied the area Kane indicated. The tire tracks were clearly visible in the soft earth and they looked fresh. If their target had escaped during the night, this entire mission had been for nothing. But intelligence had been certain the target was still in the compound. "Could be a diversion," Sullivan replied quietly. "Or supply run, we stick to the plan until we know for sure." Morrison adjusted his scope and began scanning the compound more carefully. Through the powerful optics, he could see details that were invisible to the naked eye. The building appeared empty, but that didn't mean anything. Taliban fighters were experts at staying hidden, and they could remain motionless for hours when necessary. As the morning light grew stronger, Park picked up radio chatter on one of the Taliban frequencies he had been monitoring. The conversation was in Pashto, and while he didn't speak the language fluently, he recognized several words that made him nervous. "Chief, I'm hearing radio traffic that doesn't sound right," Park reported. "They're talking about Americans and something about a trap." Sullivan felt his stomach tighten. In his experience, when things seemed too easy, they usually were. The intelligence on this target had been almost too good, the compound location too precise. But they had come too far to abort the mission based on suspicion alone. "Stay alert, everyone," Sullivan ordered. "Morrison, what do you see in that compound?" Morrison studied the building through his scope, looking for any signs of life. The windows were dark and no smoke came from the chimney. A small courtyard surrounded the main building, with a few outbuildings scattered around the perimeter. Everything appeared normal, but something nagged at him. "Looks empty from here, Chief, but there's good concealment inside those walls. Could be hiding a dozen fighters and we'd never know." Kane checked his watch. They were running behind schedule, and the longer they stayed in one position, the greater the risk of being detected. Taliban fighters knew these mountains better than anyone, and they had networks of spotters positioned throughout the region. Suddenly, Chen's voice crackled through their headsets. "Movement on the ridgeline, 2 o'clock. Looks like 3 or 4 individuals moving through the rocks." Everyone immediately turned their attention to the area Chen had indicated. Through their scopes and binoculars, they could make out several figures in traditional Afghan clothing moving carefully along a ridge about 800 meters away. The figures were trying to stay hidden, but their movement was too deliberate to be innocent civilians. They're trying to get behind us, Sullivan realized. This whole thing's a setup. The pieces suddenly fell into place. The easy intelligence, the isolated compound, the fresh tire tracks leading away. Their target had never been in that building. Instead, Taliban fighters had been watching them since they arrived, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. "Pack it up, we're moving," Sullivan ordered. Rodriguez Chen fall back to the extraction point. Morrison Kane provide covering fire if needed. But as the team began to move from their positions, the sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Bullets struck the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying through the air. The Taliban fighters had been waiting for them to reveal their positions, and now they were caught in a carefully planned ambush. "Contact left, contact right," Kane shouted as he returned fire toward the muzzle flashes he could see among the rocks. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed off the mountainsides, and the SEALs found themselves pinned down with enemies on three sides. Morrison worked his sniper rifle methodically, looking for targets through his scope. He could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, but the enemy fighters were well concealed behind rocks and brush. Every time he lined up a shot, the target would disappear before he could pull the trigger. "Chief, we're surrounded," Rodriguez called out as bullets whistled overhead. "They've got the high ground on both flanks." Sullivan's mind raced as he tried to assess their situation. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves perfectly, using the terrain to their advantage. The SEALs were trapped in a small depression among the rocks, with limited cover and no easy route of escape. "Park, get on the radio. We need immediate extraction," Sullivan ordered while firing short bursts at the enemy positions. "Tell them we're in contact and need close air support." Park worked frantically with his radio, trying to establish contact with their command center. But the mountains interfered with radio signals, and he could only get static on most frequencies. The team was on their own, at least for now. Chen spotted movement among the rocks to their right and opened fire. His M4 rifle chattered as he laid down covering fire, trying to keep the enemy fighters from advancing on their position. But for every muzzle flash he suppressed, 2 more seemed to appear. "We can't stay here," Kane shouted over the gunfire. "They're going to flank us." Sullivan knew Kane was right. Their current position offered some protection, but it was only a matter of time before the Taliban fighters worked their way around to surround them completely. They needed to move, but moving in daylight across open ground would be suicide. The gunfire intensified as more enemy fighters joined the battle. The SEALs found themselves facing at least 20 Taliban fighters who knew the terrain and had planned this ambush carefully. Bullets struck all around them, and it was only a matter of time before someone got hit. Morrison lined up another shot and pulled the trigger. Through his scope, he saw one of the enemy fighters spin and fall behind a boulder. But immediately, return fire forced him to duck as bullets scattered rock fragments across his position. "One downed," he reported, "but there's too many of them." Sullivan looked around desperately for options. They were trapped in what military tacticians called the death zone, an area where staying meant certain death, but moving also meant death. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush site perfectly, using the natural terrain to create an inescapable trap. As if their situation wasn't bad enough, Park suddenly called out with news that made everyone's heart sink. "Chief, I'm picking up radio chatter. Sounds like they've got reinforcements coming. Could be another dozen fighters heading our way." The reality of their situation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. 6 Navy SEALs against 30 or more Taliban fighters, trapped in the mountains with no immediate hope of rescue. They were some of the best trained soldiers in the world, but numbers and terrain were against them. "Conserve your ammunition," Sullivan ordered. "Make every shot count and keep looking for a way out of here." But even as he said it, Sullivan knew their options were running out fast. The death zone was closing around them, and time was their enemy as much as the fighters hidden in the rocks above. The gunfire had been constant for over an hour, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Each SEAL had started the mission with 300 rounds, but sustained firefights consumed bullets faster than most people realized. Kane counted his remaining magazines and grimaced, 2 full mags left plus a partially loaded one in his rifle. "Ammunition check," Sullivan called out during a brief lull in the fighting. The responses weren't encouraging. Rodriguez had 1.5 magazines remaining. Chen was down to his last full magazine plus a few loose rounds. Even Morrison, who fired more selectively with his sniper rifle, was running low on ammunition. "We need to break contact," Sullivan decided. Morrison, can you see a route down to that stream bed? Morrison studied the terrain through his scope. About 200 meters down the mountainside, a small stream had cut a deep channel through the rocks. The streambed would provide cover from the enemy positions above, but reaching it meant crossing open ground under fire. It's doable but will be exposed for about 50 meters, Morrison reported. And I can see at least 3 fighting positions that have direct fire on that route. Sullivan weighed their options. They could try to hold their current position, but they would eventually run out of ammunition or be overrun when reinforcements arrived. They could attempt to break out through the enemy lines, but that would likely result in casualties they couldn't afford. Or they could try to reach the streambed and use it to escape toward their original extraction point. Rodriguez suddenly called out, "Movement in the rocks, 11 o'clock. Looks like they're trying to flank us again." Kane shifted his position and spotted 3 Taliban fighters moving carefully through the boulders. They were trying to get close enough to use grenades, which would be devastating in the SEALs' confined position. "I see them," Morrison confirmed, tracking the fighters through his scope, taking the shot. The sniper rifle cracked, and one of the flanking fighters dropped. The other 2 immediately took cover, but they were now pinned down and couldn't advance further. "Good shot," Sullivan acknowledged, "but they'll try again. We need to move soon." Park finally managed to establish weak radio contact with their command center. The signal was full of static, but he could make out enough to relay their situation. Broken arrow," Park transmitted, using the code for troops in contact and needing immediate assistance. 6 personnel surrounded, immediate extraction required. The response was barely audible through the static, but Park could make out that helicopters were being scrambled. However, the nearest available aircraft was still 40 minutes away, and that was if the weather held. "Chief, extraction is inbound but 40 minutes out," Park reported. Sullivan's heart sank. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours given their current situation. They needed to find a way to survive until help arrived, but their ammunition wouldn't last that long with the current rate of fire. Suddenly, Chen spotted something that made his blood run cold. "Chief, I see an RPG team setting up on the ridgeline." Sullivan followed Chen's pointing finger and saw 2 Taliban fighters assembling a rocket-propelled grenade launcher about 400 meters away. Once that weapon was ready, their rock shelter would become a death trap. "Morrison, can you take them?" Sullivan asked. Morrison swung his rifle toward the RPG team and studied them through his scope. They were partially concealed behind a large boulder, and the range was at the edge of his effective accuracy. But he had to try. "Long shot, but I'll take it," Morrison replied, adjusting his scope for the distance and wind. The sniper took a deep breath, let half of it out and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the boulder just inches from the RPG gunner's head, forcing both men to take cover. Morrison worked his bolt and fired again, this time hitting the rocket launcher itself and damaging it beyond use. "RPG is down, but they'll have more," Morrison reported. The intensity of enemy fire increased as the Taliban fighters realized their time advantage was slipping away. Bullets struck the rocks around the SEALs constantly, making it impossible to move without exposing themselves to accurate rifle fire. Rodriguez tried to spot targets through the chaos, but found himself pinned down by a machine gun position he hadn't noticed before. The heavy weapon was positioned in rocks about 300 meters away, and its sustained fire kept all the SEALs pressed against whatever cover they could find. "Machine gun 2 o'clock, Rodriguez reported. "Can't move while that thing's active." Kane had an idea, but it was risky. "Chief, if we can create a diversion, I might be able to work around to the right and get an angle on that machine gun." Sullivan studied the terrain and the enemy positions. Kane's plan could work, but it would require the rest of the team to draw fire while he maneuvered. If Kane got caught in the open, he would be cut down immediately. "Too risky," Sullivan decided. "We'll find another way." But their options were disappearing rapidly. The Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions, and the SEALs' ammunition was nearly exhausted. Chen was down to his last magazine, and Rodriguez had already switched to his pistol to conserve rifle rounds. Morrison continued to work his sniper rifle, taking carefully aimed shots whenever targets presented themselves. His accuracy was keeping some of the enemy fighters pinned down, but for everyone he suppressed, 2 more seemed to appear. "Chief, I count at least 25 fighting positions," Morrison reported. "Maybe more, they've got us surrounded." Sullivan realized they were running out of time and options. The death zone was closing in, and soon they would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He began to accept that this might be his last mission, but he was determined to take as many enemy fighters with him as possible. Park tried desperately to establish better radio contact, but the mountains continued to interfere with their communications. He could hear aircraft in the distance, but they were too far away to provide immediate assistance. Suddenly, an unexpected sound cut through the gunfire. It was the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle, but it wasn't coming from any of the SEAL positions. Someone else was shooting, and the shots were coming from a ridgeline about 800 meters to the north. "Did anyone else hear that?" Kane asked, pausing in his firing. Morrison studied the northern ridgeline through his scope, looking for any sign of the shooter. The shots had definitely come from that direction, but he couldn't see anyone among the rocks and vegetation. Another shot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by shouting in Pashto from one of the Taliban positions. Someone had just hit one of the enemy fighters, but who? "Unknown shooter on the North Ridge," Morrison reported. "Can't see them, but they just took out one of the Taliban positions." Sullivan was confused but grateful. Someone was helping them, but he had no idea who it could be. There were no other friendly forces in this area, and their support team was still 40 minutes away. 3 more shots rang out in quick succession, each one followed by reduced fire from the Taliban positions. The unknown sniper was extremely accurate, hitting targets at long range with what sounded like a powerful rifle. "Whoever that is, they're buying us time," Sullivan realized. "Morrison, can you coordinate with them?" Morrison tried to spot the mysterious shooter but had no success. The sniper was too well concealed, or perhaps too far away to see clearly, but their shots were definitely having an impact on the enemy. The Taliban fighters seemed confused by the unexpected threat from their rear. Their fire slackened as they tried to identify and engage the new shooter. For the first time since the ambush began, the SEALs had a moment to breathe and reassess their situation. Rodriguez took advantage of the reduced pressure to move to a better position among the rocks. As he low-crawled between boulders, he spotted something that made him pause. Fresh brass cases glinted in the sunlight about 50 meters up the mountainside, and they weren't from any weapon his team was carrying. "Chief, someone's been shooting from a position above us," Rodriguez reported. "I can see brass cases, looks like .338 Lapua." Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. .338 Lapua was a serious sniper cartridge, typically used by military and law enforcement precision shooters. But who else would be operating in this remote area with that kind of weapon? The unknown sniper continued to engage targets around the valley, each shot precisely placed and devastatingly effective. The Taliban fighters were now caught between two forces, and their organized ambush was beginning to fall apart. But Sullivan knew they weren't safe yet. Even with help from the mysterious shooter, they were still outnumbered and low on ammunition. They needed to use this opportunity to either escape or improve their position before the Taliban fighters regrouped. "This is our chance," Sullivan decided. "Morrison, Rodriguez, move toward that streambed. Chen, Park, provide covering fire. Kane, you're with me." The team began to move, using the confusion among the Taliban fighters to their advantage. But they all knew that their survival depended on the continued accuracy of their unknown protector in the mountains above. The movement toward the streambed was treacherous, but the unknown snipers covering fire made it possible. Every time a Taliban fighter tried to engage the moving SEALs, a precise shot from the northern ridge would force them back into cover or eliminate them entirely. Morrison reached the streambed first, sliding down the rocky bank and immediately taking up a defensive position. The narrow channel was deeper than it had appeared from above, providing excellent concealment from the enemy positions on the mountainside. "Streambed is secure," Morrison reported. "Good cover and concealment. I can see about 200 meters in both directions." Rodriguez joined him moments later, followed by Chen and Park. Kane and Sullivan brought up the rear, moving in short rushes while the others provided covering fire. The unknown sniper continued to engage targets around the valley, keeping the Taliban fighters' heads down during the critical movement. Once the entire team was in the streambed, Sullivan took a moment to assess their situation. They had better cover now, but they were still trapped in the valley with limited ammunition and no immediate escape route. "Park, what's the status on extraction?" Sullivan asked. Park checked his radio and managed to get a weak signal. "Still 25 minutes out, Chief. Weather's getting worse up north, might delay them further." Sullivan grimaced. 25 minutes was a lifetime in a firefight, especially with their ammunition situation. They needed to find a way to link up with their mysterious benefactor or find another route out of the valley. Morrison studied the terrain around them through his scope. The streambed wound down the mountainside toward a larger valley where they had originally planned to be extracted. If they could follow it without being spotted, they might be able to reach a more defensible position. Chief, this stream leads toward our original extraction point, Morrison observed. If we can move down it about a kilometer, we'll be in better terrain for the helicopters. But moving down the streambed would mean leaving their unknown protector behind, and Sullivan wasn't sure they could survive without that covering fire. The Taliban fighters were regrouping, and he could see them moving to new positions that would allow them to engage the SEALs even in the streambed. Suddenly, a new sound echoed across the valley. It was the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round. The explosion struck the rocks about 50 meters from the streambed, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. "Mortars!" Kane shouted, pressing himself against the streambank. More rounds fell around them, walking closer to their position with each shot. The Taliban fighters had called in indirect fire support, and the streambed that had seemed like salvation moments before was now becoming a death trap. "We need to move now," Sullivan decided. "Down the streambed, stay low, move fast." The team began moving along the rocky channel, staying as low as possible while mortar rounds exploded around them. The unknown sniper seemed to understand their situation, because shots began targeting what appeared to be the mortar crew's spotters on the surrounding ridges. Chen slipped on the wet rocks and nearly fell, but Rodriguez caught him and helped him regain his balance. The streambed was treacherous footing, with loose stones and slippery surfaces that made rapid movement dangerous. Behind them, the mortar fire continued, but it was becoming less accurate as they moved further from their original position. The unknown sniper's harassment of the spotters was working, forcing the Taliban fighters to relocate their observation posts. Morrison, moving at the front of the formation, suddenly held up a closed fist to signal a halt. Through the sound of distant explosions, he had heard something that made him freeze. Voices speaking in Pashto, very close to the streambed. Two Taliban fighters appeared on the bank above them, looking down into the channel. For a split second, both groups stared at each other in surprise. Then training took over and weapons came up simultaneously. Morrison's rifle fired first, dropping one of the fighters immediately. Rodriguez engaged the second man, who managed to get off a wild shot before being hit. The brief firefight was over in seconds, but the shots had revealed their position to other enemy forces in the area. "Contact front 2 enemy down," Morrison reported quietly, "but they got a shot off. Others will know where we are." Sullivan knew their movement along the streambed had just become much more dangerous. Taliban fighters would now be moving to intercept them at various points along the route, turning their escape path into another ambush site. "Pick up the pace," Sullivan ordered. "We need to reach the extraction point before they can set up another trap." The team moved faster along the streambed, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind them, they could hear vehicles starting up, probably Taliban fighters using motorcycles or small trucks to reposition around the valley. Park tried again to contact their extraction team and managed to get through with a clearer signal. "Extraction team, this is Alpha. We're moving to alternate LZ, will mark with strobes. How long until you're on station?" The response came back immediately. "Alpha, extraction is 15 minutes out. Be advised, we're tracking multiple vehicles moving in your area. LZ may be hot." Sullivan felt a mix of relief and concern. Help was finally close, but the Taliban fighters were repositioning to contest the extraction. The next 15 minutes would determine whether the team made it out alive. Morrison spotted movement ahead and signaled another halt. Through his scope, he could see at least 3 fighters setting up an ambush at a bend in the streambed about 100 meters ahead. They had moved quickly to intercept the SEAL team's route. "Ambush ahead," Morrison whispered into his radio. "At least 3 fighters, maybe more. They're waiting for us at the bend." Sullivan studied the terrain around them. The streambed was narrow at this point, with steep banks on both sides. Going around would mean climbing out into the open, where they would be vulnerable to fire from multiple directions. "Can you take them?" Sullivan asked Morrison. Morrison studied the enemy positions through his scope. 2 of the fighters were well concealed behind rocks, but the third had exposed himself slightly while moving into position. "I can get 1, maybe 2 if I'm lucky," Morrison replied, "but there might be others I can't see." Before Sullivan could respond, the sharp crack of the unknown sniper's rifle echoed across the valley once again. One of the Taliban fighters at the bend spun and fell, hit by a shot from the mysterious marksman who continued to watch over them. "Unknown sniper just took out one of them," Morrison reported with amazement. "How is he seeing what we're seeing?" Kane had been thinking the same thing. The unknown sniper seemed to have perfect situational awareness of the SEAL team's movements and the threats they faced. It was almost as if he was watching them through advanced optics and coordinating his fire accordingly. Doesn't matter how, Sullivan decided. We use it. Morrison, take the shot while they're distracted. Morrison lined up his shot and fired, hitting the second Taliban fighter. The third man immediately took cover and began firing blindly down the streambed, his bullets striking rocks and water around the SEAL positions. Rodriguez worked his way forward along the left bank while Chen provided covering fire. When he reached a position where he could see the remaining fighter, Rodriguez put two quick rounds center mass, ending the threat. Clear front, Rodriguez reported, but we need to keep moving. I can hear more vehicles coming. The team resumed movement along the streambed, but their ammunition situation was now critical. Morrison was down to 5 rounds for his sniper rifle. Kane had 1 magazine left for his carbine. The others were in similar situations, with most of them preparing to transition to their pistols. As they moved, Park could hear helicopters in the distance. Their extraction team was finally approaching, but the sound of rotor blades would also draw every Taliban fighter in the area to their location. Helicopters inbound, Park reported, 2 minutes to LZ. Sullivan looked ahead and saw where the streambed opened into a wider valley. That was their extraction point, but it was also where the Taliban fighters would concentrate their forces for a final assault. This is it, Sullivan told his team. Last push to the LZ. Once we're in the open, we'll have air support, but until then we're on our own. Morrison spotted the extraction site through his scope. It was a small clearing surrounded by rocks and sparse vegetation, barely large enough for a helicopter to land. But he could also see muzzle flashes from at least 6 positions around the clearing. LZ is hot, Morrison warned. Multiple enemy positions around the perimeter. The sound of helicopters grew louder, and Sullivan could see the aircraft approaching from the north. Attack helicopters flanked the transport bird, their weapon systems already engaging targets around the extraction site. Air support is engaging, Park reported, watching the helicopters work over the enemy positions. LZ is being prepped. But even with helicopter support, the SEALs would have to cross 50 meters of open ground to reach the extraction point. With their limited ammunition, that distance might as well have been a mile. The unknown sniper fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, eliminating targets that the helicopters had missed. Someone was still watching over them, providing precision fire that complemented the area suppression from the aircraft above. Move, Sullivan ordered as the transport helicopter flared for landing. Stay low and head for the bird. The team burst from the streambed into the open valley, running toward their salvation while bullets whined overhead and explosions erupted around them. Behind them, the mysterious sniper continued to provide covering fire, though none of them had ever seen his face. The run to the helicopter felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably less than 30 seconds. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet as the SEALs sprinted across the open ground, their gear bouncing and their lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Chen stumbled and nearly fell when a bullet passed so close to his head that he felt the wind displacement. Rodriguez grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, shouting encouragement over the noise of gunfire and rotor blades. The transport helicopter sat in the clearing with its engines running and rear ramp lowered. The door gunners were firing their weapons at Taliban positions around the perimeter, while the attack helicopters circled overhead, adding their own deadly contributions to the firefight. Morrison reached the helicopter first, diving through the open door and immediately turning to provide covering fire for his teammates. Kane and Park arrived moments later, both men breathing hard and checking themselves for wounds they might not have noticed in the adrenaline rush. Sullivan and Rodriguez brought up the rear, with Rodriguez helping Chen, who had twisted his ankle during the sprint. As they reached the helicopter, Sullivan turned back to scan the ridge lines one final time, hopping to spot their mysterious protector. "Everyone on board," the crew chief shouted over the engine noise. Sullivan did a quick head count, 6 up, let's go. The helicopter lifted off immediately, banking hard to the left as it climbed away from the valley. Through the open door, the SEALs could see muzzle flashes still winking from the rocks below as Taliban fighters continued to fire at the departing aircraft. As they gained altitude, Morrison grabbed a pair of binoculars and studied the northern ridge where the unknown sniper had been positioned. For just a moment, he thought he saw a glint of reflected sunlight from among the rocks, but it disappeared before he could focus on it. "Did anyone see our guardian angel?" Morrison asked the others. Kane shook his head. "Never got a visual, but whoever it was saved our lives today." Sullivan pulled out his map and studied the area where they had been operating. The northern ridge where the sniper had been positioned was marked as uninhabited terrain, with no villages or structures for miles. So who had been up there and why had they helped? Dr. Park checked each team member for injuries as the helicopter flew toward their base. Chen's ankle was swollen and would need attention, but otherwise the team had escaped without serious wounds. It was miraculous considering the intensity of the firefight they had just survived. "Chief, we need to report this," Rodriguez said, sitting near the door and watching the mountains pass below. "Someone else is operating in our area and they've got serious skills." Sullivan nodded, but he was already thinking about the report he would have to write. How do you explain being saved by a ghost sniper who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously? The brass would want details he simply didn't have. The flight back to base took 40 minutes, during which time the SEALs tried to make sense of what had happened. They had been caught in a well-planned ambush, surrounded and outnumbered, with their ammunition running low. By all rights, none of them should have survived. But someone had been watching over them, someone with exceptional marksmanship skills and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The unknown sniper had eliminated at least 8 Taliban fighters that they had counted, possibly more, and had done so from distances that would challenge even the best military snipers. When they landed at their forward operating base, Sullivan was immediately summoned to the Tactical Operations Center for a debrief. The mission commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, was waiting with several intelligence officers and the helicopter crews who had participated in the extraction. "Glad to see you made it out," Harrison said as Sullivan entered the briefing room. "We monitored the radio traffic. Sounds like you ran into more than you bargained for." Sullivan sat down and accepted a cup of coffee before beginning his account of the mission. He described the intelligence that had led them to the compound, the discovery that it was a trap, and the subsequent firefight in detail. When he got to the part about the unknown sniper, Harrison leaned forward with interest. "You're certain there was someone else engaging targets?" Harrison asked. "Absolutely certain, sir. We counted at least 8 confirmed kills from positions we weren't occupying. Long-range precision fire with what sounded like a .338 Lapua or similar cartridge." One of the intelligence officers, a major named Sarah Walsh, consulted her notes before speaking. "We don't have any other friendly assets in that area. No other special operations teams, no conventional forces, no allied units." Sullivan spread his map on the table and pointed to the ridgeline where the shots had come from. "The fire was coming from this general area. Morrison saw brass cases from our position that confirmed someone had been shooting from an overwatch position above us." Harrison studied the map carefully. The area Sullivan indicated was remote even by Afghan standards, with no roads or settlements for miles. If someone had been operating from that position, they would have had to walk in through extremely difficult terrain. "Could it have been Afghan National Army?" Harrison suggested. "Maybe a unit we weren't briefed on." Major Walsh shook her head. "I checked with all the ANA commands in the region. No units were operating in that area, and none of them have the precision weapons or training to make the shots you're describing." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. If it wasn't friendly forces, then who had saved the SEAL team? The Taliban certainly wouldn't have been shooting at their own fighters, and there were no other factions operating in that particular region. "There's something else," Sullivan added reluctantly. "The timing of the shots was too perfect. It was almost like whoever was up there could see what we were seeing and was coordinating their fire accordingly." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Every time we identified a threat, the unknown sniper would engage it immediately. When we were trying to move to the streambed, targets that would have blocked our route were eliminated. When we reached the ambush at the bend, the sniper took out one of the fighters just as Morrison was lining up his shot." Major Walsh made notes as Sullivan spoke. This level of coordination would require either direct visual contact or sophisticated communications equipment. But visual contact from the distances involved would require exceptional optics, and radio monitoring would require knowledge of their frequencies and encryption. "I want to organize a follow-up mission to that ridge line," Harrison decided. "If someone was up there, they left evidence behind, brass cases, footprints, maybe even equipment." Sullivan agreed, though he doubted they would find much. Whoever their mysterious protector had been, they had demonstrated exceptional fieldcraft and situational awareness. Such a person would be unlikely to leave obvious traces behind. The debrief continued for another hour as Sullivan provided details about Taliban positions, weapons, and tactics. The intelligence would be valuable for future operations in the area, but the questions about their unknown benefactor remained unanswered. When the meeting ended, Sullivan rejoined his team in their quarters. They were cleaning their weapons and writing their individual reports, but the conversation kept returning to the identity of their mystery sniper. "I've been thinking about it," Morrison said as he cleaned his rifle. "The shots we heard came from at least 800 meters, making consistent hits at that range on moving targets in combat conditions. That's world-class shooting." Kane nodded in agreement. "And the timing was too good to be coincidence. Whoever it was had to be watching us through high-powered optics and reading the tactical situation in real time." Rodriguez had been quiet during most of the discussion, but now he spoke up. "What if it wasn't a person?" The others looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" Chen asked. "I mean, what if it was some kind of automated system? A remote-controlled sniper platform or an AI-guided weapon system?" Sullivan considered the possibility. Remote weapon systems existed, and artificial intelligence was becoming more sophisticated every year. But the technology required to operate such a system in those conditions would be extremely advanced. "If that's what it was, then who was operating it?" Morrison asked. "And why would they help us?" Park had a different theory. Maybe it was a ghost. The others laughed, but Park was serious. "I'm not joking. These mountains are full of stories about spirits that protect warriors who fight for just causes. Maybe something supernatural was looking out for us." Sullivan didn't believe in ghosts, but he had to admit that what had happened defied easy explanation. Someone or something had saved their lives, and they might never know who or what it was. As night fell over the forward operating base, the SEALs prepared for rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new missions and new dangers. But they would carry the memory of their mysterious guardian with them, a reminder that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected sources. Outside, the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, same stars that shone down on the remote ridge where someone had watched over 6 Navy SEALs and changed their fate forever. 3 days after the mission, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison assembled a reconnaissance team to investigate the ridgeline where the mystery sniper had operated. Sullivan volunteered to guide them, despite the risks of returning to an area where Taliban fighters were still active. The team consisted of 8 soldiers: Sullivan and Morrison from the original SEAL team, 4 Army Rangers, an explosives expert, and a forensics specialist from the Criminal Investigation Division. They were transported by helicopter to a landing zone 2 kilometers from the target area and approached on foot through the rugged terrain. Morrison led them to the approximate position where he had heard the sniper fire coming from. The area was a maze of large boulders and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent concealment and multiple firing positions. Finding evidence in such terrain would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. The forensics specialist, Sergeant Lisa Martinez, began a systematic search for brass cases, footprints, or any other signs of human presence. The Army Rangers established a security perimeter while the others searched, all of them aware that Taliban fighters could return at any time. After 2 hours of searching, Martinez called out from behind a large boulder, "I've got something over here." The team gathered around as she pointed to several brass cases lying among the rocks. They were .338 Lapua Magnum cases, just as Rodriguez had suspected. The brass was clean and showed signs of recent firing, confirming that someone had indeed been shooting from this position. But what Martinez found next was even more interesting. Scraped into the rock face behind the firing position were dozens of small marks, like someone had been keeping a tally of their shots. She counted the marks carefully. 37 marks, Martinez reported. If each one represents a shot fired, this person was here for a long time. Sullivan studied the tally marks. They weren't random scratches, but deliberate marks made with a knife or similar tool. 37 shots suggested that their mystery sniper had been watching the valley for days, not just during the firefight with the SEAL team. Morrison found the next clue. Behind another boulder, partially concealed by loose stones, he discovered a small cache of supplies. Water bottles, energy bars, and a sleeping bag indicated that someone had been living in this position for an extended period. This wasn't a coincidence, Morrison realized. Someone was conducting surveillance on that valley for days, maybe weeks. The explosives expert, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, made an even more disturbing discovery. Hidden among the rocks, he found the remains of an improvised explosive device that had been carefully disassembled. This IED was professionally dismantled, Torres reported. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They found the device, disarmed it, and then destroyed the components to render it useless. Sullivan felt a chill as he realized the implications. The Taliban fighters had probably planted IEDs along the routes they expected the SEAL team to use. But their mystery protector had found and neutralized the devices before the SEALs could stumble into them. Martinez continued her forensic examination and found something that made everyone pause. Pressed into a patch of soft earth behind the firing position was a clear bootprint. The tread pattern was distinctive, and she photographed it from multiple angles. Military boot, Martinez observed. Probably size 11 or 12. The wear pattern suggests someone who spends a lot of time walking on rough terrain. But the most significant discovery came when one of the rangers noticed something glinting in the sunlight about 50 meters away. Wedged into a crack in the rocks was a small piece of metal that turned out to be a damaged scope lens. Morrison examined the lens fragment through a magnifying glass. It was high-quality optical glass, the kind used in expensive military or law enforcement scopes. But the surface showed strange wear patterns, as if it had been exposed to extreme conditions for an extended period. "This scope has seen some serious use," Morrison commented, "and this glass quality suggests military-grade optics, not civilian hunting gear." As the team prepared to leave, Sullivan took one final look around the area. The evidence they had found painted a picture of someone who had been conducting long-term surveillance of the valley, someone with military training and access to professional equipment. But who was this person and why had they been watching? And more importantly, were they still out there somewhere? The helicopter extraction went smoothly, but as they flew back to base, Sullivan noticed movement on a distant ridgeline. For just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing among the rocks watching their helicopter pass. But when he pointed it out to Morrison, there was nothing there. Back at the forward operating base, the evidence was processed and analyzed. The bootprint was compared to databases of known personnel in the region. The brass cases were tested for fingerprints and DNA. The scope lens was examined for manufacturer markings. But all the tests came back negative. No fingerprints, no DNA, no matches in any database. The scope lens bore no manufacturer markings or serial numbers. It was as if their mystery sniper had never existed, leaving behind only the evidence of his actions. Major Walsh compiled the findings into a classified report that was forwarded to higher headquarters. The official conclusion was that an unknown friendly had provided assistance during the SEAL team's extraction, but the identity and motivations of this individual remained unclear. However, Walsh privately suspected there was more to the story. The level of skill demonstrated, the quality of equipment used, and the intimate knowledge of the terrain suggested someone with extensive special operations experience. But who would be operating independently in such a remote area? 3 weeks later, Sullivan and his team were deployed on another mission in a different part of Afghanistan. They were tasked with reconnaissance of a suspected Taliban weapons cache in the mountains near the Pakistani border. The mission proceeded normally for the first 2 days. They established an observation post overlooking the suspected cache site and began gathering intelligence on enemy activities in the area. But on the third night, something unexpected happened. Park was monitoring radio frequencies when he picked up a transmission that made his blood run cold. Taliban fighters were discussing an ambush they had prepared for American Special Operations Forces. They knew the SEAL team was in the area, and they were moving to surround them. Sullivan immediately ordered his team to prepare for extraction, but before he could radio for helicopter support, the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the valley. Someone was engaging targets in the darkness, and the Taliban radio chatter suddenly became panicked and confused. "Unknown sniper is active," Morrison reported, scanning the area through his night vision scope. "Same signature as before, long-range precision fire." Over the next hour, the mysterious marksman systematically eliminated Taliban fighters who were attempting to set up ambush positions around the SEAL team's location. The radio intercepts revealed that the enemy force was being decimated by accurate fire from an unknown position. When morning came, the SEAL team found evidence of at least 12 Taliban fighters who had been killed during the night. Each shot had been precisely placed, suggesting exceptional marksmanship skills and intimate knowledge of the enemy's movements. But once again, there was no sign of the shooter. No brass cases, no footprints, no equipment left behind. It was as if their guardian angel had appeared from thin air, eliminated the threat, and vanished without a trace. Sullivan began to realize that this was not a coincidence. Someone was deliberately protecting his team, following them from mission to mission and intervening whenever they faced overwhelming odds. But the identity of this protector remained a complete mystery. Over the following months, similar incidents occurred throughout the region. Special operations teams would find themselves in desperate situations, only to be saved by precise sniper fire from unknown positions. Taliban fighters began to speak in whispers of a ghost sniper who appeared wherever American forces were in danger. The legend grew with each telling, Some said it was the spirit of a fallen American soldier who had returned to protect his brothers. Others claimed it was a secret government program using artificial intelligence and robotic systems. A few insisted it was simply a highly skilled operator who preferred to work alone. Sullivan never learned the truth about their mysterious protector, but he carried the memory of that day in the death zone for the rest of his career, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, someone was watching over American soldiers, and they might never know who it was. The war in Afghanistan eventually ended, and the special operations teams returned home. But the legend of the ghost sniper lived on, passed down through the ranks as one of those stories that define the Brotherhood of Warriors. Some stories, Sullivan realized, were more important than the truth behind them. In the end, it didn't matter who their guardian angel had been. What mattered was that someone had cared enough to risk their own life to save others, asking nothing in return. In a world full of darkness and violence, that simple act of anonymous heroism shone like a beacon of hope. And somewhere, perhaps, the mystery sniper was still watching over those who needed protection. A ghost in the mountains ensuring that good people made it home to their families.